Hi, everyone. Let's please give our warmest welcome to Chuck Davis. He is a recently retired portfolio manager with MetLife's Investment Management Real Estate Strategies Group. That was a mouthful. He joined MetLife in 1995, and during his tenure, he was involved with over $8 billion in mortgage originations and over $4 billion in equity investments, including acquisitions, dispositions, leasing, and development. And prior to that, he was the regional director for the entire Southeast region. He has over 30 years of real estate industry exposure, including his previous experience as a VP with Bank of America's real estate banking group, focusing on construction lending. And prior to that, he was a division manager for AM Resco in South Florida. And it all began when he launched his career in apartment acquisitions with a predecessor company of Trammell Crow Residential. He is a Gator, and he earned his Bachelor of Science in Business Administration and Finance and also earned an MBA from Georgia State University. We are very lucky to have you here.
Y'all hear me okay? Hear me all right? All right. Thanks for the introduction. I haven't spoken, I think the last time I spoke at the Ring Speaker Series, it's going to be 15 plus years ago. As I say, I was like 6'3" and could touch the rim back then. So now I'm a little bit older. So anyway, it was kind of interesting. Dr. Ling actually said to me, he goes, well, you can't just retire. So you've got to come and actually speak one time at the Ring Speaker Series. So thanks, Dr. Ling, Dave, for being such a good friend. I've known so much of the staff for the Center of Real Estate Studies for a long time. Goes way, way back. It's amazing how much time flies, that old saying. So you heard about some of my background. This whole presentation was actually done by my daughter, Christine, who actually graduated from the University of Florida about a year and a half ago. She's into the branding marketing world. She said it was going to be very boring to talk about myself. So what I decided to do is kind of talk about my career, but as though it's a critique. And things that applied back then, do they apply today? What you should look out for if you're perhaps going into that that area of expertise. I'll give you my 2 cents on worth about what I think that's worth nowadays and what you can learn or not learn. I kind of end this with, it's not like I'm trying to teach one of Dr. Ling's classes, but I constantly follow the real estate investments world. Still have a lot of friends in that business, obviously. It's interesting, I have 2 people that actually were my bosses at MetLife. They actually ended up getting married, which is very interesting, and they live in Tampa. So I stay in touch with them quite a bit. So the industry, as you know, everybody knows everybody. They have a tendency to speak a lot, and once you're kind of into it and you enjoy the industry, and I hope some of y'all that are thinking about getting in the industry, this kind of piques your interest on that. I would tell you that over the long haul, I expect the real estate world to remain very viable as far as all the investment classes. So I don't see it really kind of losing its luster. It's going to go down a little bit right now, but I think it's still very, very viable, and it's a great career opportunity. So with that kind of introduction, I'm going to ask 3 questions. It's always good to know your audience. So how many people here are accounting or finance majors? Or wannabes? Anybody building construction? God bless you. Then I have to ask this question. How many are the MSRE program or JD MSRE? You better all be here. Gosh, Delaney made them all show up. And then the question my daughter thought I should ask is, of everybody, you can raise your hand one way or the other, is Thursday night still a good night to go out in Gainesville? Yeah, okay, good. Everybody's raising their hand, yeah. All right, so let's get in a little bit of kind of the educational background and get that out of the way. So you can see, as Audrey announced, I did get my finance degree here at the University of Florida. I really wanted to get into what you would call securities and portfolio management. That was kind of the background of why I wanted to get a finance degree. It's one of those areas where I guess when I was getting through graduating in 1980, that was kind of where everybody wanted to be. Everybody wanted to be a stockbroker, or you want to kind of move to New York. So I took that as kind of a stride about what I wanted to do. I also was on the University of Florida men's tennis team. That's why you see this picture here. Some of you may recognize Brian Shelton. He's the former men's coach. And I'll give a little story about that, is that I actually, while I was getting the next degree at the Georgia State University, getting my MBA, I was also the assistant tennis coach at Georgia Tech. And the last recruiting class before I decided to get out of the tennis world, Brian was part of that class. So I've known Brian, 35 plus years. Great guy. I know some of y'all may follow tennis a little bit, but Ben Shelton is the real deal. So keep following. He's a great guy. I'm not sure if any of y'all know him. He's going to do very well for a long time. And it also influenced my career. That's one of the reasons why I put this on here. Going to Georgia State University. So you'll notice I graduated in 1980 and then 1984 with an MBA. This is a little bit interesting. That's a pretty big gap. Back then, we didn't have really Masters of Science programs, so everybody went for MBAs. I ended up at Georgia State University because of a professor I had here at the University of Florida, a guy named Dr. Jerry Gay. And he was getting his PhD at Florida. He actually had an engineering background originally. He was getting his PhD. And he was fascinating how he was trying to take a lot of engineering formula principles and trying to apply those to finance. I thought it was great. He was a big influence. He actually said, you really shouldn't get your MBA at the University of Florida. I said, well, I'm kind of accepted. I go in the program, you should go somewhere else. And a lot of times you'll hear that people say, don't get your undergraduate degree and graduate degree at the same spot. That's changed a lot, but I ended up going to Georgia State, which is in downtown Atlanta, by the way. And the reason I went there was because of Dr. Gay, who then went to Georgia State University, and for about 10 or 15 years, I think he's still part of the program there. The last I saw, I went and said hello to him. He was one of the leading futures options theory guy in the United States. So he would do a lot of consulting. He would teach one class every semester or quarter back then. And the rest of the time he would do consulting with all the guys like Salomon Brothers, which was still around back then, or a lot of the investment banks. So that's how I ended up at Georgia State. And again, my background that I wanted to pursue was really in kind of securities analyst world or portfolio management. Loved it. So kind of the funny thing is that I get this degree, and while I'm getting this degree, I'm actually out interviewing. So I'm interviewing, and who was around to actually interview with? Well, a lot of banks were around at that time. They all had credit training programs. I'll talk about that a little bit. The other thing that was kind of going on was, like I said, the securities analyst world. There were certain things as you get into the corporate finance world. I didn't really care about that. MCI, which was an old predecessor company. I almost went with them in the corporate finance world. And then out of nowhere, a little bit because of my tennis days, a partner who was at Trammell Crow actually told me to come interview with him. So I'm saying this once again because one of the themes that you're actually going to hear here is where you start is not where you finish. I bring that up over and over again. So this is the family, okay? Out of that 6 people there, 4 went to the University of Florida. The 2 on the left and the 2 on the right. The middle ones, Claire, who's in the very middle in the black dress, she actually went to FSU because she wouldn't go to Florida while her brother was at school here. She was accepted here and went to FSU to stay away from her brother because he was one of those types like, don't talk to that guy, your dress is too short, don't do that. So very controlling, she didn't like that. And the other daughter went to NYU film school. So she lives up in Brooklyn. The reason I bring this up is because, again, Christine, who's in the green dress, actually did the whole presentation. A couple other fun facts, a little bit about the family is my father, I told some of the group right before we got here, actually went to undergraduate school here. His main professor was a guy named Dr. Arnold Ring. So the full circle of life thing comes back. Chuck gets to speak in the Ring Speaker Series. My dad used to sing nothing but praises about Dr. Ring. I know Dave knows him, and a lot of the people at the school have been here for a while. But he did not even interview for his first job. He got Prudential Insurance actually sent a note to Dr. Ring and said, we want 15 of your students to report to Jacksonville, Florida. That used to be the Southeast headquarters for Prudential in the old days in their investments group. And we're going to teach them everything we need to know, but we want 15 of your best students. So my father got this letter. It said, show up like August 1st in Jacksonville. That doesn't happen much anymore. But to give you an idea, that's how well respected the program was. And you have to remember, my father graduated in '52. Real estate wasn't even really that big of a deal. Dr. Ring was kind of on the cutting edge of that. So that had an influence on me, obviously my father going to school here. One of the other things that I kind of talk about flipping from the security side, securities analyst world, kind of getting into the real estate world, I detested what my father, no one would say what he did, but the fact is that real estate used to go through these huge boom and bust cycles. So at one point in time, I remember my father actually had made some loans on some Orlando motels because this famous place coming up was called Disney. And they started building motels there like crazy. Matter of fact, over a period of about 3 or 4 years, they built something like 25,000 hotel rooms, all before Disney opened. So what actually happened is the demand for Disney wasn't there. A lot of those motels got foreclosed. I actually watched and heard, I watched a little bit from the car, my dad actually selling TV sets out of the motel to try to recoup a loan. So I was like, who wants to be in this world? Real estate world sucks. It's much better to be in the securities world. Information flows are much better. So that's the reason why I didn't really want to go into real estate to start with. So a little background first on the way I view the world. So you can see I actually took the E off private. I shouldn't have done that. She told me not to touch it. Anyway, I view the world like this, and maybe all investments, but particularly also real estate. There's the private world, there's the public world, there's the debt world and the equity world. And you can play in all those in different quadrants, okay? So if that's the way you want to kind of play, I will tell you where I've played most of my quadrants. I played a lot of time in the private world, both debt and equity, only marginally in the public side. So I never did CMBS lending. I touched it. I never really launched a public fund. I have friends who did that, and sometimes I helped with it, but I didn't really touch the public side that much. And the reason I mention that, it's probably where I was in my career. This will be different than where you are in your career. Because again, real estate for a long time, particularly what I'll call investment grade real estate, was growing up. Information flows weren't there very often, or weren't that easy to find. And so it was a very private world. So that's what I grew up with. It's a little different nowadays. The other thing I kind of mentioned here is that, and I told the group right before I spoke a little bit, I view the world as kind of institutional or non-institutional, and that's hard to say. So some of my comments are really institutional side. I consider anything that's income-producing property can be considered institutional, but really it's creditworthiness of those income flows that come off the property. This is the MetLife building that sits over 200 Park Avenue over Grand Central Station in New York. When I used to have meetings, I used to have to go to the 12th floor of this building. MetLife still has a presence there, even though they sold the building. They bought it, I think, 30 years ago. They bought it for something like $250 million. And then about 10, 12 years ago, they sold it for $750 million. But it's required for MetLife to actually keep their name on the building. They have to have a presence there. So they have a big boardroom there. So every once in a while, I'd have to go there for meetings. They have conference rooms there. The non-institutional side, like I said, can be anything that makes income. The Swamp Restaurant makes income. I would not consider that institutional, okay? They sell a lot of hamburgers and stuff like that. But I really view kind of stuff that's more typical credit tenant-wise institutional versus non-institutional. One other thing I kind of want to talk about here a little bit is I also talk really about the main food groups. So in the institutional world, it's usually apartments, retail, industrial, office, and you can throw hotels in there. A lot of people call those the top 5 major ones. I know some of you on the MSRE program all know that, but that's where a lot of my world was, particularly with MetLife. A little bit prior to that, I was also in that same world. Did not really delve into the non-institutional world. And by the way, you can make a lot of money in non-institutional real estate. Sometimes the information flows aren't there, and sometimes the bid-ask price and things like that, either on the lending or on the leasing side or even on the sales side, can create great value. And I've had a lot of friends that do that. So I'll go a little bit further. So again, my theme here is where you start is not where you finish. And you can see here's a timeline. And what we're going to do is we're going to critique my career. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened in each step of the way. I'm going to tell you what I learned. I'm going to tell you then what the kind of the pros and cons and whether or not that still applies today. I'll give some comments on that. And then really what happened after I left. So the first one that's up here that you kind of see is Trammell Crow Residential. Again, coming out of having been a college tennis coach and actually teaching tennis, I actually ended up running into some people who knew a guy named Ron Terwilliger. Ron Terwilliger was a big tennis buff. He was creating this company back then called Crow Terwilliger Properties. And I got a chance to actually interview with him. And I was like, I don't want to be in the real estate business, but maybe I should go ahead and do this. I had 2 or 3 offers from other banking groups that had great credit programs. One was in Dallas that eventually went belly up, but they had a great real estate program there called Mercantile Bank. So maybe it was fortuitous that I decided to go, well, Trammell Crow has a great name. They still have a very good name. They're still well known. It was a private company, and Ron ran the Eastern United States for apartments. So I'll start with that one, but then you can see how it leads to NCMB, Ameresco, Nations Bank, and MetLife. So this is not to say your career would look like it, but I would say that, again, I jumped whenever I had a chance to things that I thought were good, and then lo and behold, I stayed at MetLife for 28 years. So it's a long time. Here's a picture of the Overlook 2 building that's in northwest Atlanta. It's called Vinings. This was one of the buildings that I actually worked in. There were actually 3 buildings there, 1, 2, and 3. The third building is probably the tallest building. You may see that if you're ever driving up I-75 in Atlanta, northwest side of Atlanta. So here we were, Trammell Crow. Ron Terwilliger was building this kind of, I would call it an empire on the east coast of the United States. He actually was a Harvard grad, actually had been in the Navy. He was actually I guess he was in nuclear submarines for a long time. He got his MBA at Harvard, then decided to get into the real estate business working in Dallas. He met Mr. Crow and he started this team. So he built over a period of probably about 10 years, a little bit prior to when I was there, when I left. So this is like 1984 to 88, I actually worked there. Right prior to that, up until 88, he had built 90 apartment complexes. So he's actually in our Hall of Fame, correct? And I still stay in touch with Ron every so often. He's retired. But with all of his little developers, he set up Atlanta, Orlando, he set up in DC, he had somebody in Charlotte, he had somebody in Nashville. They built 90 apartment complexes over about a 10-year period. That is rampant. I can't even tell you. Fortunately, they had a lot of construction management expertise in-house because you can lose control. The next thing, how he did most of those projects was with an 80-20 bond program. So there are a lot of different times the federal government or even state governments will step in and they'll try to create programs to create housing. 80-20 bond program, was called that, is that 80% of your residents could actually be market rate, but 20% had to be 80% of the median income for that area. So you actually had to track your residents and where their income levels were all the time. If you did that, then you got 110% financing by selling these bonds. Does anybody know the return on a project with 110% financing? It's called infinite, all right? And so here I am joining Trammell Crow. I said to Ron, I don't understand the yield model on this. He goes, you're so stupid, it's infinite. So they built a lot of projects, did very, very well getting them out of the ground, getting them leased. They were all Class A. Then the strategy for me was a little different. My strategy was actually, I came in, he used to hire a lot of attorneys and a lot of tax accountants. My immediate boss was a guy named Jim Potts. And the goal was for us to actually buy apartment complexes that were Class B and renovate them. Move the rents. Usually they had to be near a Class A project that maybe Trammell Crow had built or knew about. And the idea was to run those and kind of create value. Capitalization was also through the 80-20 bond program. We did a couple of JVs. Ron did a couple of JVs, which you would consider more normal today, but mostly it was 80-20 bond program. So what did I learn while I was doing this? We didn't have underwriting models. There was no such thing as Project or Argus. Matter of fact, the first few pro formas we all did by hand. There were 2-year pro formas. That was the max. And so doing all your kind of what-if scenarios was kind of laborious. Actually, one of the things, and maybe this happens in your career, I was the first guy to ever actually use spreadsheets at Trammell Crow. So there was a thing called Lotus 123, it's the predecessor to Excel. I actually created my own 10-year cash flow models. I used natural logarithms and things of that nature to kind of smooth out and back out. If I wanted to get a yield of 10%, that was a target we talked about, what did my rents have to grow over a period of time so I could actually get that yield? So it gave a benchmark to the property managers about how fast they'd have to move the rents. Ron thought this was unbelievable. This is great. I'm glad you're actually doing this. Well, when I started doing it, we ended up turning down a lot more projects than what had been happening in the past when you did it by little 2-year pro formas. So that was good. I did that on my own. Maybe the same thing happens to you. Maybe you could use some of the things you learned under any of the real estate programs here at the University of Florida. The other thing that happened is, like I said, information was very poor. It was very hard to find owners who wanted to sell. So I used to cold call. A lot of people said, I don't sell, I just buy. Used to hear that all the time. But I did identify a bunch of those over a period of time, and we ended up doing 3 of them. So you had to source the deals. Then I had to find GCs that actually knew how to renovate units. Believe it or not, there's a skill to doing that. It's much better nowadays. I think Rick Scarola does that. He's one of our Covenant Capital. He's done a very good job with that. In the apartment world, we can sometimes call it lipstick on a pig, where you just come in and do a mild renovation, maybe change out the appliances and things like that, or you do a major renovation, which is gutting the units. This was more of that light renovation program. And I had to find people that did it, because internally, all our guys knew how to do was actually build brand new. The other thing that was a kind of a problem, pros and cons with this, is that the property management company under Trammell Crow Residential was in-house, and they only knew how to lease Class A apartments. They didn't know how to deal with a Class B tenant. They didn't know how to move the rent roll up. So even though we could actually kind of lease these units, you could always say it. The idea was that back then to move the units only $100 a month in rent. Nowadays, I think some of the models are $200 to $250 a month. We could do that, but we had trouble actually, getting the property managers to actually identify with the residents. It was a totally different resident profile. The other thing was reporting. And we have much better reporting nowadays. So the average partner that worked for Trammell Crow Residential, they would get their financials on their properties 3 months after every quarter. That's all they get. Quarterly reports, 3 months late. So it was always a delay. So can you imagine trying to direct your property managers on what they should be doing with OpEx and rents when they're delayed that much? The market's moving much faster than that. So it was a real problem. The one thing that Ron Terwilliger did, which I thought was great, he brought in his brother, Bruce Terwilliger, who ended up working for Equity Residential in Chicago. Bruce stayed in the Navy. He actually taught at the War College in Rhode Island. He was one of the leading guys in the world, in the military world, on computers, computer science, and how to use information flows. He gets hired, and we did this thing. For the first time, they had a thing called a file server. Nobody had ever heard of file server. Everyone had mainframes. So just so you know, that allowed you to actually not have to spend as much money. And IBM got mad because Bruce Terwilliger wouldn't let us buy a mainframe. We actually eliminated 2/3 of the accounting staff. We put on every single apartment, we had a computer. Imagine that. That was novel. So 90 properties had to teach property managers how to download rent rolls every night. Had to also send in, I think it was at least monthly back then, what was happening with NOI on the properties. So now they can make very quick decisions. They could adjust very quickly. So that all happened during my short tenure there. So I had a couple of quotes I thought I would let you hear from me. So the first project I ever do, that I got it fully renovated, and it was in Northwest Atlanta, not too far from the office. I bring Ron Terwilliger over. I said, Ron, we've renovated this project. Tell me what you think. And by the way, we're 100% occupied. And he went like this, and he went, "You're fired." I went, "Well, you haven't even walked the project yet." And he goes, "No, it's not the project. The fact is that you're 100% occupied. That means you aren't pushing the rents fast enough. If we're 100% occupied, you've messed up." So I took that to heart. Needless to say, he was just kidding, but he made his point. He also made a very, very good point, is that real estate goes through cycles. And I never really understood this, but sometimes you have to look at real estate as a long-term asset. A lot of people don't do that as much nowadays. But he goes, we will actually build through cycles. So his idea was to always have his pipeline going at all times. So he had new product coming in and old product going out. His idea was to sell projects every 3 to 5 years and then replace them with some new projects. Worked very well for him. The interruption, which I actually think I put up here as the 1986 Tax Act, I call that the end. That was an abrupt thing that happened while I was there. Suddenly, under the Reagan era, we went from accelerated depreciation to 30-year depreciation, sometimes 40-year depreciation on real estate assets. A lot of what happened with that real estate bond program is we could shelter income. If you start doing things under 15 years, I have all these kind of income that gets tax sheltered, and it was going right to the pockets of all the owners. So now all of a sudden, I've got to actually be a cash flow type oriented investor group, or in this case, development manager. And it was an abrupt change. And I remember going in and talking to Ron. I go, Ron, what are we going to do? And he goes, it's going to suck. It's going to suck for a while until we can figure out a new capital source. So that's a theme to keep in the back of your head. When does capital sources come and go? How they impact you? So long-term depreciation's gone. These tax-driven syndications are gone. And so I ended up leaving. But after I left, a couple of good things happened to Ron. He actually took a lot of the projects and he made 2 REITs that are very famous nowadays. Gables REIT, which is now based in Atlanta, and Avalon Bay. Huge REITs. And he made a lot of money from that. And I remember visiting him probably about 5-6 years after I left. He actually came to Tampa one time and saw me. And I said, Ron, why don't you take Trammell Crow Residential public? Why are you doing these like pockets, or groups of portfolios of properties and putting them into REITs? And he goes, you don't want to be public. You want to own public stock. But in the real estate world, because of the long cycle, I can't have somebody telling me month to month or quarter to quarter how I'm supposed to run my company, because these cycles are long and I can't run my life by quarter. Very interesting. So he obviously made a lot of money with those sales of those REITs. He actually called, by the way, when they were building and selling all these apartments, he called it REIT food. REITs were growing at a huge rate back in the late 80s and early 90s. They kind of got shut down for a while, but REITs are one of the main holders of equity real estate nowadays. So today, would I tell you that it's good to be a developer? So, if you had something that happened like this, you'd say, that's really great, okay? And there's lots of development models out there. You can build, I have friends who do nothing but build dollar stores. And they build them, they get a 20-year lease, and they sell them, they make money. That's almost institutional grade, but very small dollar. All the way up to the big guys. Trammell Crow still exists. There's the Crow Holdings family. They actually still do big industrial projects around the country. My comeback to you is, if you decide to go in the development world, everybody wants to get the big D on their cap, on their forehead, and say, I'm a developer. I will tell you, that's good. It's good to learn development. But you've got to go through the cycles. Depending on your product type and depending on capital flows, it'll either be great, but store your nuts when it actually goes soft. So I'm hopeful that all of you will get in some way, shape, or form to touch the development world. I did that in some of my previous predecessor career steps. See if there's anything else I kind of wanted to say about that. I think that's kind of it. Let me go to the next one. So here I am. The world's kind of slowing down. I'm a young guy, at least I was back then. I didn't want to sit around and just become a property manager while we kind of figured out the capitalization side. I started looking around trying to interview with people. And there was one bank that was actually hiring. I didn't want to work for a bank. You work for a big national developer, last thing you want to do is not work for a bank. I had somebody from the University of Florida who was a good friend call me and say, hey, you need to come down to Tampa and actually interview. So I said, okay, I'll do it, because I had a lot of friends in Tampa. I said, free flight down to Tampa. I'll hang out with my buddies for the weekend, blah, blah, blah. Well, the banking world was going through a massive change in the mid-'80s and the late 80s. And so what I actually ended up doing is going down there. I think the oldest person that was running what became NCMB, which became Nations Bank, which became Bank of America, The oldest person in the whole bank was 45 years old. Okay, and I had somebody actually call me. Her name was Tara McKay. She worked in the HR department. She was a friend. She goes, "Come down to interview." I actually had to go through a credit training program. I was the oldest guy in the credit training program. Most people were out of the school at 22. I was 30. So all this is going in the back of my mind. I said, I was just hesitating on taking the job, and I got a phone call from a guy named Ken Lewis. Ken Lewis ran the Florida Bank. He then became, subsequently down the road, the CEO of Bank of America. Anyway, he calls me up. He was kind of a brash style. This goes into the whole thing with these massive changes that are going on in the banking world. He calls me up. I'm at Trammell Crow, and I'm kind of like, yes, I know who you are, Mr. Lewis. He goes, "Don't call me Mr. Lewis, call me Ken." And he goes, "Here you have an offer from us." I said, "Yes, I do." And he goes, "Is it a fair offer?" And I go, "Yeah, it's a fair offer." He goes, "Well, I want to give you a little consulting on your career." I said, I would appreciate that. He's kind of a big fish. "I think you'd be a pretty stupid son of a bitch not to take this job." I called back, listened 24 hours, and I took that job. So that's how I ended up in that beer can building. Like I said, I went through a credit training program. I learned about all sorts of debt. I also learned how to underwrite businesses, corporate lending, inventory lending, floor planning, which is what you do with cars. I learned about, actually in the shipbuilding area, I learned a lot about that. That was interesting because, again, I like that securities analyst world. So I liked looking at all these different industries and how you actually lent to them. So that credit training program was great, even though I was, like I said, the oldest guy in there. The idea was then to make you a commercial banker, sometimes corporate banker, commercial banker. Then, after you kind of graduate from this program, if you're really good, you become what they call a relationship manager. So I was actually posted in a platform, commercial bank lending platform in St. Petersburg, Florida. And I had a great group of people that were in my office. There's about 8 or 9 of us. And we continued to learn. We'd work with each other. I think the oldest person in the office was 34 years old. And here we are making loans to all these businesses. We're calling on people. Well, I have to let you know, in Florida, it's very hard to make a lot of business loans. So you end up making a lot of real estate loans. So believe it or not, I made little construction loans on little unanchored strip shopping centers. I had to do the draw requests. I had to do the underwriting of all the leases. And a lot of the guys on my team did the same thing. I had to, as you can see here, I had to learn how to negotiate loan pricing. I had to call on these people. I had to stay up with the credits. I had to keep a good credit file. I learned a lot about guarantee structures. So some people, when you get later in your career, guarantees are very important only because they're used as an anvil over somebody to make sure they pay you back. I had to learn about tangible net worth. I had to go after people to get their personal financials all the time. Took a lot of work, but it was kind of part of the credit worthiness lending of the banking world. One other thing I probably should tell, this team was a great team. Like I said, they kind of lent in the real estate lending world a little bit. A guy, I'm not sure if he's still on the board, Ron Wheeler. So Ron Wheeler, who was part of my team, actually became the president of Sembler, one of the largest Publix retail developers in the Southeast, and actually one of the biggest companies in the United States at that time doing retail. So again, where you start's not where you finish. So those are a lot of the pros. The cons of being in the commercial banking world is you're dealing with smaller credits, okay? Sometimes you deal with some crazy borrowers. Sometimes they're good. Sometimes they'll teach you things about industry. I learned a lot about, believe it or not, the chicken franchise industry, the chicken restaurant industry. One of the people there tried to hire me to actually start something that would be kind of like Cane's Chicken. Y'all all know, I think there's a Cane's Chicken here in town. Tried to give me, I didn't quite want to do that, so I guess the real estate thing was still bugging the back of my head. This next bullet I have going to call regulatory environment. So think about this time. Some of you study kind of the history. This is right about the time we had what is known as an S&L crisis. And so here's one of those things that cause things to cause, cycles to go up and down. OCC audits. I got to know Officer of Comptroller and Currency type auditors would come in and look at your credit files. And if they weren't documented very well, you would get tarred and feathered. So, and a lot of the stuff was all handwritten. It was kind of printed. We didn't really use computers back then. We had a few computers in each office. So that was one of the downsides. It still happens that way nowadays. It's highly regulated. The banking industry is still highly regulated. And so from time to time, you're going to go through these cycles. And it actually impacts kind of what happens later on when I talk about some other parts of my career. Today, I would say that I don't know if these credit trading programs are quite as good as they used to be. So if you're looking to go in the pure commercial banking world, try to find a bank. I think sometimes they're hiring, they go through cycles. But somebody who has a great credit trading program. I actually have a good friend of mine out of Tampa. His son is going to go work for Citicorp. He's going to work in their wealth management group. He's being trained up in New York City. He's there with a bunch of people from all over the world. They're all coming there, so he's getting great exposure. He calls me all the time to talk about bank credits. It is a different world. It's a separate world from the equity world. After I left, a couple of things here. NCNB becomes Nations Bank. So here's that massive change world. One of the things that attracted me, may attract you to any platform, is the banking world was consolidating and changing very quickly. It was fun to be with a bank that was an acquiring bank. So think about this. NCNB was somewhere around maybe a $30-40 billion bank, and now it's 3.1 trillion. Excuse me. So it's either the first or second, I think it's the second largest bank by assets under management. So that platform could give you a lot of opportunities if you stuck with it. I did have a few friends who did stick with it. I thought one of the more famous quotes that happened during that time was a guy named Hugh McCall. He was the guy that actually kind of drove all this consolidation. The idea was to keep growing NCNB and becoming a Nations Bank. He actually tried to buy a bank called CNS. They were actually based in Atlanta. He actually called up CEO and said, I want to buy your bank. And the CEO said, you have to give me 48 hours notice. I'll give you a response. I'll give you a response. Give me that much time. And he basically came back and said, you have 24 hours or I will launch my missiles. That was a quote in the newspaper. So to say the banking world went from this kind of stodgy world to kind of a very aggressive world was kind of fun. And I remember actually being in cars with a bunch of people there. I guess they were young bankers, and we actually drove cars around the CNS building, going around the bank, saying we're going to buy you. So, fun things. So, this led to kind of the next statement here. My daughter thought it'd be funny to put this little thing from It's a Wonderful Life on there. So I kind of teased you with the idea the S&L crisis was going on. And what caused the S&L crisis by and large was they got away from actually lending on homes and things of that nature, more of a residential side. They were lending on commercial projects all over the United States. They didn't know anything about commercial lending per se. So, S&L based in Florida lending on a strip shopping center, say in Pennsylvania, they didn't stay up with their collateral very well. That's one thing you have to do in the banking and lending world. You've got to stay up with your collateral. So that kind of caused a problem. There was an oversupply of a lot of different product types. It kind of dragged the banking world into that also. So that's why I mentioned the RTC, the Resolution Trust Company days, corporation days. So commercial real estate kind of got a bad vibe during that time. There was a crisis with it. Any banks that had loans to them all had to pull in their horns. They started trying to collect those loans. They had to work out quite a few loans. I actually got drafted into what you'll see the next bullet in there is called a special asset bank. This is really your special loan workout area. Okay? So the idea was to resolve loans, issues, and try to collect proceeds. That's all you did. And because I happened to be one of the older guys that went through the credit training program, and also that I had somewhat of a real estate program, they thought it'd be good that Chuck go into this world. I have to tell you, it was completely eye-opening. I was really doing the asset management side, looks like a misspelling there, which was the properties would get kind of discussed, they'd foreclose on them. I would have a team that actually would kind of try to take these properties in. We try to stabilize the property management, try to stabilize the leases, get the value up to a certain point, and then dispose of them. So I learned a lot about the legal process. And one of the things I learned is how good your legal documents are and how good your attorney is. And I learned a lot about court systems and what it looks like when you're a big bad bank in front of the poor little lender that's sitting, your borrower sitting there going, well, they took me for a ride. And so it's kind of an interesting world. You really learn. I'll give you a couple of anecdotes from Old Man Davisism here. If somebody really doesn't want to pay you back, there's a way for them not to do that. Okay, they can make it extremely painful for you, no matter what the documents say. A lot of that can just take on and on. I had one foreclosure that lasted 3.5 years. So you can imagine how much time and legal expense that actually takes. So it's not always fun. Some people would do deed in lieu. They would just give you the properties back, or what we like to do was friendly foreclosures. That way you could actually BK all the leases and start fresh. So I learned a lot about how good loan documents were. I learned a lot about asset management. You got to remember, a lot of the stuff that I took back was non-institutional grade in many regards. It might be an unanchored strip shopping center. I remember one project that came back. I knew all these property managers all over. I never forget this guy's name, God bless him, Marsh Ferreira. NCMB had bought a bank down in South Florida, and this housing building came back, and all I had was a street address, and I sent Marsh over. Marsh, can you go look at it? It was occupied, didn't have any running water or electricity, had 15 Haitian families living in it. Okay, they were all squatters. He goes up there, and they all threatened him with machetes. So, and the good thing is that Marsh was an ex-Marine and carried a 9mm right here. So he was one of my special guys. But just, it's funny, but the fact is, a lot of times the stuff that's not investment grade is the stuff that gets foreclosed on. I took back some office buildings, and by the way, the one thing I never took back was an apartment complex, because somebody's always willing to try to do something to keep the residential world going. Is there anything I can tell you a little bit more about that? So I made a lot of contacts in the business, particularly South Florida, which was great. That carried on in my career. I learned a different negotiating style, having to deal with bad borrowers, if you want to call them that. And the reason why Ameresco was set up, I should probably give you a little bit of a name to that. The Special Asset Bank of MetLife, they viewed this as a line of business. Okay, and once again, this is a career thing. They said, why don't we spin y'all off and y'all actually buy other portfolios from other banks that have destituted or loans and things like that they don't know what to do with. It takes a lot of time and knowledge to learn how to be someone who forecloses a lot or works in a special asset unit. I have to tell you, a lot of them are not always, they're not your typical banker, okay? One guy in particular, I remember, he taught me a lot of things. He goes, I went with him, we're going to foreclose on this property. He goes, we're going to meet the borrower first. We walk in, the borrower walks over to shake our hands. This guy's named Sam Gugliotta, who was my friend. He goes, I'm not here to shake your hand. I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here to get this property back. And so it's automatically adversarial. But you do learn a lot, like I said, a lot about loan docs. So I learned it's a totally different world, and we're going to go through that cycle a little bit right now. And that's the reason why I mentioned it. If you want to do that as a career, I would say it has a shelf life. Okay, so if you do get the chance to do it right now, there are a lot of opportunity funds out there. They're raising money. I think they're going to buy all sorts of foreclosed properties. Right now, what's actually happening is there are a lot of loan sales. Loan sales are faster than foreclosing on a property. You get, as a bank, I'll let somebody else deal with the issue of foreclosing. I told the group that I met with right beforehand, there's a whole world of how you actually negotiate that world and make money in that world. But if you get onto a platform like this, just know that it has a tenure to it. I actually had a previous site at NCMB Texas. A lot of the guys that were on my team had been with a predecessor bank that NCMB bought. And they actually worked that bank out through all of its workouts with the FDIC and made a lot of fees. So I had a lot of Texas brethren that I actually learned about the foreclosure world from. Eventually, Nations Bank buys and becomes Nations Bank by CNF's Sovereign Bank, which that was going straight up the kind of mid-Atlantic. They had all sorts of bad loans. So there was always fresh stuff coming in. About, I would probably say, kind of like 1980. Well, this is kind of like the time frame was like 93 or so. I'd been there from like 91 to 93. We started working through stuff. I could see the writing on the wall, and I started having people kind of actually call me, you need to probably get out of this business. So this is what kind of happened at the end. Ameresco continued trying to buy loan portfolios. They started trying to buy loan servicing portfolios. They eventually went BK. Okay? They were owned by a private equity group out of Atlanta, kept trying to grow the platform. They started buying loan portfolios. They started buying bond portfolios, and they got whipsawed by something that's happening today, a dramatic rise in interest rates. And all of a sudden their bond and loan portfolio was worth nothing, and they went BK in 1998. So that gives you an idea. That's why I said the final exit was kind of messy. So then I get talked to by people saying, hey, you need to come back to the bank. So again, I'm kind of on this timeline. Somebody says, well, let's put him in the real estate lending group. So then I learned a lot about construction lending. I didn't know really, I'd done draws with banks in the past. Most banks, particularly large banks, do have specialized real estate lending teams. And most of the time it is construction. Without them, I don't think we'd be able to grease a lot of the development that happens in the United States. So it's very, very important that they exist. It's specialized. You learn a lot about recourse lending. So this gets back to the guarantee structures. You start learning, like, I've got to have somebody, as you used to call somebody warm on the bad boy or carve-outs in my non-recourse world, but I have to have somebody really good in the recourse world. Because while this thing's being built, it's worth nothing. If it doesn't get through to completion, that's your whole goal. Your second step is to get it leased up. So I was really lending on what you would call income-producing properties. A lot of them were apartment complexes. I think Tim and I were talking about that a little bit. But I learned a lot about the draw process. The most interesting thing happened under my first apartment complex as a real estate lender. The first draw happens, and I actually go out to the site to meet with an inspector. He's hired by the bank to go look at the draw and make sure that things are going in on the property and being built the way it should be built. And I showed up on the site, and he looked at me and goes, well, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm the lender. I'm kind of the relationship manager. He goes, well, I've been doing this for 35 years. I've never had a banker show up on a site for a construction loan. So that gives you a little idea what happens to a lot of, again, my background is know your collateral, know how it's going up. So a lot of things that can cause problems with real estate loans with banks is they don't really understand the profile of the property type. They understand how to make a loan. They understand how to actually try to do draws with the administrative staff. And by the way, the profitability of a construction loan to a bank is usually its number one most profitable loan. The reason being is, as I put on here, is the fees. You charge a big group of upfront fees, so you're in a sense discounting the loan already. You actually earn income while you're doing draws, because you earn income on those draws. And then at the very end, you're trying to get paid out. So that's actually the end of the strategy. But it's very heavy administrative work. You have to always stay up, obviously, with any liens on the property. The legal side is extremely important. You got to try to get information from your borrower all the time. And by the way, whatever they pro forma on their draw schedule never happens. And one of the worst things that can happen to you is a construction bust. So suddenly the project takes 20% more than it took before. And so you're leaning on your guarantor again. You guys have got to put more equity into the deal to actually get the thing finished. A lot of times that's that push come shove thing that happens in the real estate lending world. The other thing I would say probably about this world is that you spend about, kind of mentioning it, I used to spend 90% of my time on the administrative side and 10% of the time on actually calling on people and looking at real estate. So that's something that you have to take in mind if you go into this world. Again, the overall strategy nowadays is to actually get it built, get all those fees, and then try to get out of the loan as fast as you can. Either the project gets sold or you get a permanent lender to come in and actually take you out. If you can do that, and that's, say, most of these construction loans are 1 to 2 year construction loans, followed by a floating rate period of, say, 3 years, if you can actually get out, the quicker you get paid out, the more highly valued the loan yield is on that loan. So that's what most of the banks do. So that's why a lot of times they like merchant builders, because merchant builders, all they're doing is building, creating this value with a lease up, and then selling it. Downside is, I mentioned a little bit about the OCC, it's always under heavy scrutiny. We're kind of going through that cycle right now where a lot of the construction lenders have pulled their horns in. They're all looking at their book of business. They're analyzing the heck of it. They are basically telling the people today that they're lenders on their staffs, don't lend. Let's get through this cycle and see how these projects do before we start lending again. So that is something that happens with, like I said, the private debt side or the private equity side. You're going to have to deal with this whole thing that happens with the construction lending side. And by the way, one of the things that's interesting is I can tell you, from MetLife, how they looked at loans. a lot of these lenders, like regional banks, a huge loan to them would be 20 million bucks. Some of the bigger banks, even you'd be surprised, will not go over 50 million bucks. And they syndicate these loans. So if you have a $100 million loan, you might have 5 construction lenders that are banks involved. That gets into a whole nother world of how loans are syndicated. It makes it more complex. There's more chairs at the table on that project. So I'll give you one other thing about this I kind of mentioned here. Nations Bank goes coast to coast. They buy Bank of America. They did what Hugh McCall wanted. Ken Lewis helped make it happen. They're huge. During this downturn that happened during my Amoresco days, they decided to take their real estate portfolio from roughly 18 to 20% of their loan portfolio down to 12 to 15. I think it still sits about that size. So they are not one of the most prolific real estate lenders out there. They're big, they do this business, but it's not one of their mainstream businesses. One of the larger lenders out there that I dealt some with Nations Bank, but I also dealt with Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo at one time during the downturn had 30% of their portfolio in real estate loans. It actually should have gone under, but the federal government wouldn't allow them to go under. So they're one of the guys who came through the other side, kind of like a Bank of America. They're huge now. They are still a very prolific lender. PNC is a big lender out there also. I'm trying to think if there are any. Here locally, let's see, I'm trying to remember if anybody here locally that's really good in the state of Florida. I know Bank of Ozarks come there. Is anybody locally that's really good? Yeah. So anyway, but all the little banks try to make these real estate loans. I told you they de-emphasize lending. They are also now into the permanent lending world. So if you're looking at this, pros and cons, some of these banks actually do have permanent lending programs. I've actually, like I said, borrowed from PNC on a shopping center that I had in my portfolio out in LA. Usually they're the 3 to 5 year. I try to get fixed rate. Most of the time they're floating rate, but I had a fixed rate loan. They try to use some derivatives and try to use that for their best customers, but they're not really in the permanent lending area per se. One thing I should note, I was only here for 1 year. Okay, and everybody goes, God, that's not a very good career path. And the reason was I had a boss that was from CNS, and he was terrible. I learned nothing from him. I learned everything from my peer group. And I got this other opportunity, which we're going to talk about with MetLife. But the fact is, I couldn't find him for 2 weeks to actually quit. He wouldn't come to the office. He was out actually running for public office. So I remember the first time I tried to hand in my resignation notice, and the first thing, he didn't even say, try to talk me out of it. He just said, oh, damn, they're going to fire me now. They told him if another person had quit under his team, he was fired. Guess what? He got fired. So sometimes it happens. You get on these platforms, you get great bosses and bad bosses. That was probably my worst bad boss kind of situation. Okay, so my daughter wanted to put Snoopy on there. Snoopy used to be a branding thing with MetLife. They used to have the blimps, got rid of the blimps. Just to talk a little bit about branding, they bought that brand. I think there were only 2 companies that could use Snoopy in the branding. MetLife used it. They bought it from the Schultz estate, and you had to be of a certain quality type company to actually use Snoopy. MetLife de-emphasized Snoopy. You will never see it again because we didn't want to be associated with a dog. When you go to certain countries, being associated with a dog is not a good thing. In certain countries, they may even eat dogs. So sometimes it was not very, very becoming, so we had to get rid of that brand. But she thought it was funny to put Snoopy up. I used to give her Snoopy dolls all the time. I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown, kind of an overview of each one of my steps. So now I'm back actually into 1995. Through 2003, that's when I started as an investment analyst. And I thought you would like this because here I am, where you start, again, is not where you finish. I was a vice president when I left, and I got hired by, she did that. I got hired by MetLife to be an investment analyst. It meant nothing. They told me within 3 months I was a senior investment analyst. I was 36 years old, 37 years old, and now I'm a senior investment analyst. You would think your career is going in the wrong direction. But I took it in stride. I learned probably the most in my career I ever learned by working with somebody who'd been in the business. Literally, I guess MetLife actually made the first loan on the Empire State Building. So they were in the business for literally 80 years. They've been in over 100 years. There's a deep set of knowledge there, and it carries on through the whole company. I learned a lot about non-recourse lending. And what this meant is I had to actually understand my collateral. I understand the leases, the quality of the improvements, and MetLife made big loans. Okay, I think the smallest loan I ever did by accident was like $5 million. But over time, all my loans became much bigger. I think the largest loan I ever did was $350 million. And so I lent on a lot of bigger institutional type properties. This picture right here is actually one of the buildings I was actually in. That's the Met West buildings in Tampa, Florida. I think Glenn Becker actually spoke one time in the Ring Speaker Series. Okay, Glenn was actually the asset manager who actually worked on that. Met West is right near the airport in Tampa. If you ever go by, you'll see that was another project that we ended up doing. But I started lending on big loans were 20 to 350 million bucks. I saw nothing but big buildings. A lot of it was office. So remember, MetLife was in the office world on the equity side. I'll talk a little bit about that, but also on the debt side. I think 50% of the portfolio was in the office loans. 50% of the portfolio was in equity loans. So I would go talk to asset managers about how to run properties. It was great. The strategy was, when I came on board, is the mortgage portfolio was worth about $9 billion and the equity portfolio was worth about $9 billion. So this is 1995. You have to remember that we only had 10 people in the lending group when I joined MetLife. The idea was to grow that thing as quickly as possible. By the time I got out, kind of in the permanent lending side a little bit, even as a regional director, it went from $9 billion to $72 billion. So it did work. Once again, this is a startup mode. It's fun to be on platforms that are in startup mode. That's kind of the thing I come back with. The other thing, it was their money. Insurance companies have liabilities. How many people here understand asset liability matching? Okay, good. So what's the thing with the insurance world? You pay premiums. If it's a life policy, I don't have to pay that back for 30 plus years, hopefully, if I do my actuarial tables correctly. So a lot of times I can make permanent loans that are longer. So when I joined MetLife, we only had one loan type. Non-recourse loan, 10-year fixed. That's all it was. And the average loan I made when I first joined MetLife was 8%. That's a big number nowadays. So, and believe it or not, people wanted that. You're considered kind of a preferred lender when you're in this world. But the good thing is it matched the liabilities of MetLife. So pretend MetLife is actually selling all these kind of insurance vehicles, and it's a pyramid. And what you try to do with all sorts of investments using duration models is you actually try to make investments that absolutely mimic that pyramid. So there's call protections on these. So a lot of times I would say a 10-year loan, you couldn't pay me back for 5 years. If you did, then there was yield maintenance. Some of y'all will get at that in some of your classes. The idea is to make me whole because I'm trying to match those assets. So real estate lending, particularly permanent lending, works very, very well with the insurance world. And that's why the insurers that are in it do very, very well. I talked a little bit about the 10-year. I actually was one of the guys that actually got us into doing floating rate loans. So what happened over a period of time, this is kind of from 95 to 2003, and even kind of when I was a regional director, MetLife's liabilities started becoming not just this big, kind of bell shape out to the side, it became barbellish. And so very, very quickly, they started saying, hey, we understand how now these mortgages actually fit with our portfolios that we're trying to create to back our liabilities. Do you have any floating rate stuff? And I said, absolutely. That's what I did in the banking world. So I came up, me and another guy who was actually out of DC, Brian Casey, who now works for Walker & Dunlop. We created the floating rate program. And so suddenly we started making these kind of like, I think the shortest we'd make is usually like 3 years, but we would make 3 to 7 year floating rate loans. Some people really like that demand for that product. So again, the portfolio of MetLife's overall liabilities become barbellish. We start feeding that. And that's one of the things that kind of fed the portfolio growing as fast as it could. I tried to actually start a construction to permanent program. So one of the things, if you're a developer, again, I remember Ron Terwilliger saying, oh, I hate this. I always have to get a construction loan. At the end of the construction loan, I either got to sell it or I got to go get a permanent loan. And every time you touch something, it costs money from the financing side. So I go, why don't we create a construction to permanent loan program? We did that right before the great financial crisis, but I was in charge of that, and it was great. I actually got to even work on construction loans in Mexico City. I got to work on construction loans in Santiago. I did a few here in the United States, but we always did it with really good borrowers. Actually lent money to PGIM. And so I would say the program worked. We proved how profitable it was. But then everybody goes, oh, nobody wants to do construction loans anymore. We're through a cycle, and they shut it down, and they've never really gone back to it. There are a handful of insurers that do make construction loans, okay? And they don't do it, though, as a purebred type line of business. Few, I should probably have to say, most of the time, if they do one or two a year, the big companies, insurance companies, I'd say that's a rarity. So most of the time, their idea is to fund loans immediately and make interest income. Okay, see what else I can kind of give you on that. I don't think there's anything else I can kind of talk about that. Other than the fact, what I learned actually under that, I kind of hinted on this with the last group. If you do nothing else, learn everything you can about valuations. So as an insurance company, we're not regulated, and we don't have to have appraisals like you do under FIREA law. So every time I did a loan, I had to go find my own expense comps, my own tax comps, my own land comps, obviously my own income or leasing comps. I had to do that. I had to actually walk through the competitive set of whatever property it was, say it's a mall. I had to shop all the malls, had to see what their tenancy was. I had to try to gain their rent rolls, try to feel like what their rents are being paid. Is my project either below or above market rents? I had to understand their operating expenses extremely well. And then we also actually had on staff, and I kind of mentioned this later, architects. Architects are very rare in the insurance side to actually have them on your teams. So architects actually taught me about the physical plan. So you remember me talking about the construction lenders don't really understand the physical plan of what they're lending on. MetLife, being the tenure they are, they would not make a loan. I couldn't make a loan unless I had an architect sign off on the quality of that building and actually do a cost study on it. Had to look at all the mechanicals. So they would actually help me order all the environmental reports. They look at all the structural reports. We look through those, and in many cases, we would actually tell the borrower, it's really good, but you need more CapEx on this side. Your roof's going to go bad in 3 years. You really ought to pay attention to it. And by the way, my architect can tell you there's 3 different types of roof that work very well in your this area of the country, for instance. And they loved it. We became very consultative. So I would say the one thing I learned is I went from kind of like, lender, borrower to basically a consultant. And people appreciated it. And that's one of the reasons why the program grows so fast. I didn't really work my way out of a job, but kind of the next step on here was I became a regional director. And again, I told you we're trying to grow this debt portfolio. Now we're trying to grow the equity portfolio. The idea was we need to kind of get into doing more developments. People kind of liked it. Remember, equity income is lumpy, okay? If all I get is the cash flow off the property, that really is kind of what you would call opportunistic or alternative income. It's hard to asset liability match with, in other words. A mortgage I can make into a bond equivalent yield and make it look like a bond. So the idea, though, was we kept getting pushed by people like, you need to grow the equity portfolio. MetLife was very conservative with their equity portfolio. We did a couple of projects. One I actually show right here is called Wells Fargo Center. Interesting that we'd actually do that. Bank of America was actually the lender on that with Wells Fargo. That actually is a hotel called the JW Marriott Marquis. The Wells Fargo Center building is the bigger, taller building on the right. Learned a lot about that with my architect going through. We had budget busts. Learned also about development. I have a little golden rule. As a JV partner, you can never have a JV partner who has too much money. So usually what happens is developers don't have enough money, so when it hits the wall, they go, well, can you give us more cash? So I had to spend more time kind of actually retrading the ownerships in these buildings while I built them. They're successful. I think the Wells Fargo Center, we still own that in a fund with a sovereign, with a pension fund. I think it's like 92% leased now. And the JW Marriott Marquis had the largest ballrooms. There's actually, believe it or not, a ballroom on the top floor of this parking deck you see there that actually has a basketball court. So when the NBA teams come into Miami to play the Heat, they actually stay at our hotel. The top floors, we have beds that are 2 feet longer. so that the basketball players can actually stay there. And then every year there's a tennis tournament there called the Miami Open. We actually pull up all the wood floor of the basketball court, and it's a tennis court. So we actually host all the tennis players to come in, and if it's raining, they can come in and play indoors. So, little fun fact for you. The other thing I learned of being the regional director during this time is that I had to train my predecessor to become the mortgage team leader. We got into doing a lot of loan participations, and you'll see there's a picture right here of Atlantis. Anybody been to Atlantis? Okay, kind of a cool hotel. I've been on tops of every one of those buildings. The only thing I didn't do was actually swim with the dolphins. I went to the one and only resort next door, which was very exclusive. The loan on this was $1.3 billion, and they had a first mortgage on it for about $600 million, and then they had 16 other lenders behind it. We were actually what you would call the B1 slice. So we had $300 million out on this loan. During this kind of great financial crisis, the hotel didn't do very well. We actually had to work out that loan. We got paid out. Actually, they asked us to come back and subsequently lend on it. But all the lenders that were kind of like non-banking lenders that were investors, they sold their tranches of that loan at like 50 cents on the dollar. We didn't buy any of those, but then now all of a sudden, I had to find new lenders that were part of the debt team. And here we are. B of A was actually the master servicer on this debt. And we had to kind of work through the whole, capital stack and get this thing kind of repositioned. We got paid out. I think it did very well, subsequent. A lot of CapEx associated with hotels. I told the previous group about that. But we learned a lot about co-lending with other banks. And I would tell you, it was a good thing. The guy who actually was my mortgage team leader underneath me is a guy named Gary Dinka. He went to the University of Florida. He actually graduated Florida, decided to become an MAI. He was an appraiser for many, many years. Came on to MetLife. Was an asset manager. He was actually the asset manager on the Dolphin and Swan hotels for a while. That picture of the Bank of America building I showed you, he was the asset manager on that. Gary actually now lives in New Jersey, where we have our investments office. It's called Whippany, New Jersey. He gets mad about that all the time that he lives in New Jersey. But he's in charge of all the mortgage pricing for MetLife. So here's a guy who started out as an appraiser, became an asset manager. He got to the mortgage side. He was my mortgage team leader, learned to do these workouts, kept trying to do things better and better. He now prices every single loan internationally and nationally that MetLife does. So there's a career path for you besides mine. A few other things I can kind of tell you about this. Coming through the great financial crisis. Remember, this goes through 2003 through 2014. MetLife and their underwriting skills and their ability to make loans and to watch their collateral. Our default ratio, which you'll hear about coming in the press a lot more, was 10 basis points. Does anybody think that's very much? 10 basis points is out of a $72 billion portfolio? It's basically nothing. Basically, we were told coming out of the great financial crisis is that we were not more aggressive in making loans. We should have been taking more risk, because a lot of times you'll look at, I can have write-offs or I can have loans go bad at a cycle that's probably closer to like 30 or 40 basis points. For a bank, it's horrible when it becomes like 1% of the portfolio. So, 100 basis points, you're going to really have some real problems in your portfolio. So we actually started getting more aggressive. Again, the participation's kind of talked about. We talked about that. We also started getting into doing something I talk about on the next slide, which was we got into doing our own debt fund. A little tidbit that I think you know what actually caused the great financial crisis, right? The residential world, everybody, RMBS, and how we split and did third-party debt, and we had everybody was doing slicing and dicing on tranches. Everybody go like this. Yep. So when it hits the fan, CMBS is a good part of this, or RMBS is a good part of this. When you have this financial engineering, it sounds great. It's a great way to provide liquidity to particularly the real estate world. You can do it in the corporate world and other ways too, but completely in the real estate world. You never know what happens until it hits the wall. So when your collateral goes bad and you got to look at your docs, and all the lenders have to talk to each other about how we're going to work it out, and some lenders have their hair on fire, they don't have a special asset group. They don't know how to handle it. The one advantage we had at MetLife is that if I ever foreclosed on something, my asset managers just picked it up. They already knew the product type. Banks do not have asset managers. So we're in this kind of good risk relationship. So we understood how, when we took something back, which we didn't do very much, but how to actually do it. So that gave us a lot of wherewithal about how we looked at the product type. So we had a few workouts. Oh, by the way, during this time, MetLife actually buys the biggest portion of AIG, one of the largest insurance companies in the world. MetLife is actually in 65 countries selling insurance. So then it kind of takes us, to where I kind of want to rush, because I want to get a little bit to where we're talking about real estate in general. So I become this managing director. We start getting in the advisory world. We actually closed our Tampa office and actually moved it to Atlanta. We became the Southeast Regional Headquarters. So I had a bigger team. I think that office now has 35 people. We got into the advisory world. We started creating our own funds. So there's MetLife Core Property Fund. There's MetLife Enhanced Core Property Fund. We have a levered debt fund. And then we also started calling on pensions and sovereign wealth type entities. So the idea was to, again, grow the equity portfolio as much as we'd grown the debt portfolio. So there's rapid growth. The idea, though, became that we now have third-party clients. So we started actually even selling, I can't say we, I don't work for MetLife anymore. MetLife started selling assets and doing JVs with all sorts of partners. On the debt side, I think we have 26 partners that actually do loan participations with us. So think of a small insurance company like Progressive. Progressive can never make the loan on Atlantis. The largest loan they can make is $10 million. They're a small insurance company, right? But if I make that loan, I can sell that to them. So now they get exposure to a high quality asset. So we did, MetLife did a lot of that. We did the same thing with the equity side. And then we had to have a total return focus. Believe it or not, what MetLife cared about is, and they owned their whole portfolio, anytime they owned things 100% themselves, there was no debt on it. So all they cared about was the cash flow. Here we do JVs. As soon as we JVs, we could lever them and actually get a levered return, an LIR model. That was all new to the folks at corporate MetLife. So that took a little learning from their standpoint. Let's see what else I can kind of tell you about that. Right when I started talking about CMBS and RMBS, one little side thing that happens with commercial mortgage-backed securities. Right around 2000, I think it was 2009, we had this national phone call with Moody's. And one of the things you should know that MetLife is probably one of the leaders on, they worked with Torto, Wheaton, and CBRE and Moody's. MetLife actually created a forward-looking loan model to look at risk. And it would have this kind of, we'd graph it and show it as a cone. And the idea was to do forward-looking loan ratings. Prior to the great financial crisis, all you had was empirical evidence. So an OCC auditor would come in and go, do you have the past historical numbers? And we go, yes. That tells you nothing about the leases that are about to mature and that the property is going to go into foreclosure within 2 years. MetLife got way ahead of that with their loan rating system. It's one of the things I think is best about them. So here I am kind of running this bigger team. We're trying to grow the whole team. Assets under management keep growing. I'm going to go to the next slide because this is where I ended my career. And I kind of talk a little bit more about MetLife and how it all ended. Me retiring, although I'm not going to end in the real estate business per se. So I was actually asked, because being one of the more senior folks, they said, can you help us launch kind of a private fund? So I launched a thing called MetLife Multifamily Properties. I had to go around I had to do pitch books, had to do sales jobs with Eastdil and some other guys who were helping us broker this. I made a pitch to Norinchukin Bank. I did a pitch to Japan Post Bank. Had to do some of those calls on their underwriting. I remember one of the calls would start at midnight our time on the East Coast. You can imagine my asset managers on those properties really loved me. It wasn't easy. So trying to do this pitch, trying to sell, say, 50% of this portfolio and lever it. We ended up actually doing that portfolio with a group called Mubadala. Does anybody know Mubadala? Okay. They're a sovereign wealth fund out of the UAE. The group is all British and U.S. expatriates that live there that run their real estate platform. So now that's 8 hours the other way. So my time zones had to become very, you can imagine if I had an asset manager that wanted to talk to the Mubadala guys, that would be 11-hour time difference. So sometimes they would be on the phone call at 6 a.m. in the morning while it's closer to like, depending on the time zone change, could be 4 or 5 in the afternoon. So that's one of the things you learn. I learned a lot about dealing with clients, and I learned a lot about sovereign wealth funds. By the way, they're about $350 billion. They're into all sorts of things. I think they own the largest telecom company in a JV in India. They're actually sponsors on 3 tennis tournaments in the United States, which is interesting. The other client I mentioned, some of y'all that got to see Steve Spook speak, 2 or 3 weeks ago at the fall conference. I actually started calling on pension fund clients. And one of the pension fund clients that I actually kind of brought in, they told me I was very lucky to get picked by them, which is true. MetLife had never done pension advisory group. So when I actually did this, actually brought them on board, they were our very first pension fund client. And they did not like to co-invest with MetLife. It was all 100% their money. So I went from $0 with them, growing that portfolio. I guess it's about $1.5 billion now, doing all sorts of projects. They do a lot of build-to-core type projects, if you saw Steve's presentation. Love dealing with these folks. Matter of fact, they're such good friends, I still stay in touch with them. So again, the growing the portfolio was the main thing. MetLife's still trying to do that today. I talk about MetLife in general. So where are they in the advisory world? They're trying to sell to all these third-party clients. Their portfolio is about $587.5 billion. They do bond work for other people. They're into private equities. They do infrastructure loans. They do private placements. So all that goes under that heading. They have actually 260 clients. The real estate world, like I said, has about 26 on the debt side, and I guess about 12 on the equity side. Still doing a lot of commercial mortgages. You see what the value of both those portfolios are. MetLife as a asset manager is ranked in the United States number 3. I think the real estate portfolio is number 2 as an advisory side, and Blackstone has the biggest by far, $476 billion. So I talked to you a little bit about the competitive advantages we have, and particularly going into this world where we are right now is very important. And then we'll kind of jump into how I see the world. We can take questions afterwards. So one thing that MetLife has, they have a regional office system. They're in 7 cities. They're in 4 countries, 4 offices internationally. We have the architects. The debt team talks to the equity team. All the loans that are approved are actually approved at a regional investment committee by the asset managers. The asset managers don't like the property, they don't make the loan. Same thing when we buy something in the offices. A lot of times, particularly if we leverage them, the debt team actually sits on their regional investment committees. It works very, very well. We do those in-house valuations. MetLife actually reviews equity transactions twice a week and debt deals 4 times a week. No other insurance company has that kind of model. So you can actually be getting responses back to your asset manager, your acquisitions officer, or your lending guy incredibly short periods of time. A lot of times if you go to an insurance company and ask for a response and you send in all your due diligence information, you may hear over a period of 2 to 4 weeks. That makes it very hard to do acquisition financing. One thing that MetLife does is very well on the acquisition financing side. One last thing I'll tell you is that MetLife also is very heavy into prop tech stuff. So we actually have task forces that look at all the prop tech stuff that's coming out about how to run portfolios, how to actually run office buildings, retail centers, and things of that nature. We use a thing on the acquisition side called DealPath. We've actually helped them with about 2 or 3 of their most recent iterations of that, all in the help to get us up to speed and go faster. So I kind of give you a little bit of the views on that. Here are just some broad things about why real estate's good. I talked about that. Maybe I went digging about how large is the commercial mortgage market. $5.2 trillion. That's huge. So you remember how many banks and stuff are in there. Banks have probably somewhere around 50 to 60% of all those loans. Insurance companies usually have about 9 or 10% of them. Then there's all sorts of things like Fannie and Freddie Mac. They're actually GSEs that lend in that space. The equity portfolio, a lot of it doesn't have debt, is valued at somewhere between 18 and 20 trillion. So that's your opportunity set for either buying things or working in that field. I had to put this date on here, August 31st, 2016. That was the date that real estate got named by S&P as a separate sector. I also consider a defining moment because, and since real estate went from very private to very public, now you can actually track things much more with these funds. The S&P Real Estate Fund Index is used. Money started pouring in. Investment sales brokers and even retail brokers who knew nothing about real estate started selling to their private clients and either their corporate clients, you need to have real estate as part of your portfolio. And it kind of juiced all the money that's going in there and actually caused probably some of the inflation in values. I already talked about bond equivalent yields, which is good about mortgages. Relative value of a hard asset equity is lumpy. One side note, when everything hits the fan, what's happening right now, anybody that has a bond portfolio, and I remember this during the Great Recession with MetLife internally, I dealt with all the bond portfolio managers, and their portfolios were tanking. And when we'd sit in these big rooms and talk, always the ag guys, we were big ag lenders, the real estate lenders, we always had to sit against the wall. We never got to sit at the big boy table. When everything hits the fan and you watch the valuation of securities, remember securities, a lot of these bonds are just IOUs. Suddenly everybody goes, so what do we do? I go, well, we have collateral. We were all invited back up to the big boy table because we understood value. Like I said, 10 basis points of loss on our loan portfolio. They go, you guys really know this asset class. So it's a hard asset class. It's not gold. Gold doesn't really make any money, but it's unique in that regard. That's why it's a benefit to be in it. Mark-to-market issues. This is big playing out right now. I think MetLife stock went down today, maybe a little bit. When you become public, you usually have quarterly valuations done by third-party appraisers. Okay? Remember my old world I told you is we did our own in-house appraisals. We learned how to do Argus. We actually would value our port, and they still do, value each asset quarterly. Now we have an outside third party group that does it. I'm going to tell you not to bemoan the appraisal world, but I can tell you the asset managers at MetLife know the values of their properties better than the appraisers. But there's this Chinese wall, it's kind of a firewall, where we allow them to actually do valuations. We actually see what's happening on the loan side, what's happening quicker than the appraisers do. A lot of the appraisers are backward looking. They can only do with what they have, what data they have. We could see actual transactions occurring. So one of the things that happens with mark-to-market, there's a lag effect that happens now. As values go down because cap rates are going up, you're going to start seeing the values of these equity portfolios go down, and you start seeing these loan portfolios look like they have more risk. So mark-to-market is all part of the public side. We already know transaction volume is down. I know y'all read about this. I talked a little bit about with some of the folks prior to that. I have experience a little bit with manufactured housing. I actually bought a portfolio for Steve Spook and the SBA guys. I delved on trying to do some life science. Those are unique sub-segments. MetLife actually started a SFR fund to actually get in the single-family rental world. We were trying to start a fund for self-storage. Just to comment on that is that the problem with those kind of property types, except for student housing and life science, is they're small dollar figures. An average mobile home in the United States mobile home park is worth about $3 million. Some are worth $1 million. Some could be worth as much as 50 million plus, but that's a rarity. So one of the things about getting into this segment, which I think Green Street, if you ever read their research reports, really pumps a lot of these alternatives, and the lack of capex on some of these, they pump those. The problem is the small dollar figure. How you can aggregate that is really an issue. But they're very good on the yielding side. I'm going to go through this really quickly. Again, some of the stuff you already know. The demographics in the United States are changing. Job creation's been good. It's been slowing down more recently. Unemployment rate's 3.8%. And when I got out of the University of Florida, I think the unemployment rate was closer to 7%. That's considered full employment, as y'all know. There's so many jobs. This is the JOLTS report kind of thing put up there. Lots of job openings. The participation rate is still, could be higher, but it's still decently good. 9.6 million job openings. I think we were up to 12 during the peak. So I'm expecting job openings to continue to decrease, particularly as we go through kind of the slowdown in the economy. Manufacturing index 6 at 49. I think 50 plus means you're in an expansion phase, so it's not doing too badly. A lot of that's because we're onshoring a lot of stuff from China from a risk standpoint. I think that's actually saving a lot of the GCs and the contractors, to be candid with you, because as you build less right now, there's less construction lending and less development. They're actually building manufacturing plants. So that's been very good for them. So that's kind of the macro environment. Here we are, this real GDP thing. How many people think we're going to go into a recession? Anybody? Okay, yeah. So what did I say last fall? I told everybody at our conference, it's going to hit the wall. Well, not quite. It's a slow wall. And that's because so many people actually, you hear these things that people had a lot of personal reserves and that they could actually take, changing jobs, plenty of jobs. They could spend money like crazy. It's helped the retail world. All that's kind of winding down a little bit. And the one thing that's causing the problem is obviously the Federal Reserve raising rates. So I don't know what the 10-year Treasury is today, but I think it's 4.75 or better. If you were one of these funds and you're an investment banker and you launched your portfolio, say it's a $100 million portfolio, and the idea is you could borrow $50 million at less than 3% and you could juice your yield, what happens when your borrowing cost goes to 7.5%? Your portfolio sucks. So they're not able to raise money. So that's going to happen. I kind of talk about this, but economic cycles are very much a part of the real estate world, and typically the real estate world is a laggard to those. The guys who learn about it first are always the bond and the stock market world. Again, here's kind of what's happening with inflation. Inflation went off the ticker. I hadn't seen inflation like this since I was in graduating the University of Florida. By the way, we use a lot of indexes like SOFR and the 10-year Treasury. My real estate finance class, I actually went to a banker and then said, I want to pretend I'm borrowing money for an apartment complex. What kind of construction loan can I get? And he said, well, that's good. I don't think I'll lend it to you, but even if you could, because your interest rate on that construction loan is going to be 21%. So needless to say, inflation causes problems. It's caused the Fed to have to react. I think there's a pendulum swing. They've got to knock it down. This is just Chuck Davis, the economist. Tim knows this kind of stuff. I love studying the economy and what's going on because I have to see what it does to cap rates. So here's the yield curve. The yield curve's getting more flat. SOFR rate went from like 1%. Think of all those people that have floating rate loans in the real estate world. One of my themes to you is real estate is a long-term asset. You use long-term debt with a long-term asset. A lot of the investment bankers, because it was cheap, took LIBOR money, now SOFR money, and they were able to borrow at 1 to 4%, and it made their yields look great. Now they've got to go again and borrow, particularly the floating rate guys, they've got to start borrowing at SOFR, and their rates are going up towards 7% plus. And what's one of the things that's really bad about floating rate loans? You pay a fee on the front. You have to buy interest rate protection, which is a percentage of that. In this kind of environment, interest rate protection is extremely expensive. So right now, guess what? A lot of people don't like floating rate loans. They all wish they had done fixed rate loans. So Old Man Davis here, I did 2 projects I got criticized for. I'll show you one. I think I have one of these on here. One was called Carlisle Crossing. I did that for the State Board of Florida. I wanted a construction to permanent loan. I got that from Pac Life. During the time I made that loan, the rate on that was 4.5%. I got chastised for that. Remember, it's a 10-year loan. They did the construction, draws and the whole 9 yards, because I could have borrowed all the way down to about 3%. That loan was $250 million. Okay, that cost a lot of money to pay that fixed rate loan. They're very thankful for right now because they had to go borrow that rate. It would be closer to 7%. So they're very thankful for that. The other thing that I did in my portfolio manager days, remember that fund I told you, MetLife Multifamily Partners? That's the largest loan I ever did, $550 million. I negotiated the loan with Teachers Insurance Annuity / Nuveen, and I was the last guy to get a $550 million loan done by one lender. It's the largest lender that Nuveen has in their real estate portfolio, and I did it at 4.3%. So needless to say, right now, when we start talking about values, that's been a savior to those 2 deals. And I'm going to suggest to you, it's always good to have permanent debt, long-term debt. I have a couple of comments just about the regulatory world. You're about to see the raise their ugly head. The OCC auditors are going to be in on top of the banks. They already are. Insurance regulators, not so much. MetLife is regulated by the New York State Insurance Commission. It's because that's the only way insurance companies are regulated, state by state. They're the toughest regulator in the United States of all the state insurance regulators. Matter of fact, some insurance companies have a company that sells insurance in 49 states and a separate company that sells insurance in New York in case they want to quit. So the state of New York does have their act together. But the OCC and the Federal Reserve are going to be on top of all the banks, which are, again, your main lender. They're pushing these risk-based capital rules and loan reserve rules and lending guidelines, which are causing the banks to pull back. By the way, the banks have been pulling back for 2 years, okay? They learned from the great financial crisis, the banks have got to have reserves set up. So right now, the good thing that's causing the recession to slow is that the banks aren't quite as jumpy with having to go into foreclosures, okay? CMBS has their risk retention rules. Remember I told you when it hit the wall. Nowadays you have to have whoever sponsors that CMBS pool has to take a 5% slice of it. So a lot of the banks used to do that. So I'd say CMBS is probably where you're going to see a lot of foreclosures, but it's not going to be as bad as it was during the great financial crisis. And we do have some non-bank lenders that are out there, private debt funds. They're very expensive, by the way. Their money right now goes to 10 to 14%. Fannie and Freddie, I just have to mention them. They are still lending to the apartment world. And God bless Fannie and Freddie. They're a major competitor of mine. I used to say, where's my Fannie and Freddie lending money on my office building? I mean, people work here. Why can't I have a Fannie and Freddie loan from the government? And basically, they're private institutions now owned by the government, but they only want to support residential lending, okay? I got to know them extremely well in a mobile home portfolio that I did, manufactured housing portfolio, and learning how they underwrite and how they operate. They do provide liquidity. Any lender that provides liquidity to the real estate business, we got to hope they make it through these cycles. Fannie and Freddie will probably be a savior to the residential world, multifamily world. So just thought I'd pass it along. This chart's kind of hard to see, but I wanted you to see some of the numbers. And this is kind of a graph of how valuations have gone over a period of time. It's a rough estimate. Real Capital Analytics put this out. The main thing I wanted you to see is that values are decreasing over the last 3 to 2 years. So you see real estate was making this big run. Right after COVID, everything spiked. Everybody got back in. I call it the risk on, risk off situation. Risk was on. Everything's great. Everybody has money. They can pay rents. Development projects went off the ticker. And now kind of the projection of where things are going, because cap rates are going up, values are going down. And that impacts not only the developers, not only the investors, it impacts the lenders. So everybody has to pay attention to valuation. What's very important that you learn in this program if you're an MSRE student or want to be in the business? What did I say? Valuation. Learn it. Learn it better than your appraiser. Okay, I kind of mentioned some of the debt market conditions that are going on. During the great financial crisis, lenders like myself, when I was with MetLife, would go up to 75%, even making 80% loans, because I had to compete with Fannie and Freddie. After the great financial crisis, the first tranche, if you want to call it, first mortgage tranche, was 60 to 65%. Same thing on the construction side. A lot of people came in with equity and can fill that space. I would tell you right now, that's probably one of the biggest gaps that's happening. If you can get a construction loan, a lot of the lenders are going back to like 50%. So it's causing problems building your capital stacks. I already mentioned the problems with floating rate debt. I won't go into that again, fixed versus floating. I think there's going to be, like I said, limited distressed debt in the current cycle. It won't go as bad. I think, what did it get up to? Like, was it 400 billion during the great financial crisis? I can't remember how many workouts, depending on the look at the numbers. We're up to around 72, 78 billion right now, and what people are tracking as workouts. And a lot of those are loan sales. So that's working. Loan pricing, I told you, loan to values are down, indices are up, spreads are wide, borrowing money is a problem, and it's going to get very expensive. And people are going to have to do a couple of things, and I'm going to talk about. This is the lenders and the volume of loans that are coming due. And I know, don't you put these up sometimes in your classes, David, who actually has the debt? So we always call it the wall of debt that's maturing. Everybody likes to do this all the time. And you can see CMBS is kind of the red, kind of purple, reddish, it's orange up there, which is good, go Gators. But the idea is CMBS had large chunks of loans they made 10 years ago. And now all of a sudden those are going to come due. And now the values have dropped. So if they want to refinance it, they're going to have to pay down the loans. That is going to be tough. That's called capital calls. The first capital call I ever did in my career was when I was with Trammell Crow, and I do a capital call on an apartment complex. And nobody knew who Chuck Davis was. So my boss made me write a letter to a guy named Trammell S. Crow. and I wrote him this note and I said, I need $150,000. I got a phone call from, who the hell is Chuck Davis? Okay, so we're getting ready to go into the capital call world, and it's not going to be good because these loans are going to have to get refinanced or they're going to go into foreclosure. I think the smallest slice on here, you might see the insurance companies. They're kind of the small green in there. So there's a lot of refinances that are going to occur at higher interest rates, and this is why everybody thinks there's opportunities. Okay, this is the product types that are out there. So you see this big slug of the red of office. Does everybody know office kind of stinks right now, right? It's not a good product type. It's coming back slowly. Brand new product does great. If you have great credit tenants, it's wonderful. But it's really going to be a problem. I think I read some analysis, about 25% of all the kind of B and C buildings that could be converted to apartments and office, I would say maybe 25% of that can get done. I actually toured a couple of We Live projects, one in New York City and one in DC. Maybe you can convert them into some sort of residential component. The biggest thing on there is the multifamily, right? So multifamily, like I said, has Fannie and Freddie. I'm not too worried about them. I do worry about the hotel segment at some point, simply because if we go into recession, they're the first guys to feel it. Right now, they're transient and their bookings have been great, but watch the hotel sector. Industrial is just stupid. I mean, the valuations on industrial went from like 50 to 75 bucks a square foot. Now they're over 200 bucks a square foot. I think there's still a need for that industrial, so there's still more of that product being built. One of the guys who's pulled out of that business quite a bit is Amazon. There are a lot of dead Amazon buildings out there, but there's enough slack out there, I think, from other institutions that are trying to still work to build their platform delivery services. It's going to be okay. It will be the last one that causes the problem. Retail is kind of in between. I think certain retail will still do well. MetLife has actually taken back 2 retail projects in this cycle. They take more back in this current cycle than they did in the entire time I was at MetLife. They took back a mall called Galleria Mall in Dallas, and they took back the Water Street Shops retail center in downtown Chicago. So it even happened to MetLife, even though they're great underwriters. And that was retail. Equity markets, I would say right now there's a big price discovery going on. Nobody knows where value is, and appraisers hate it. If there's not enough transactions going on, nobody understands where value is. So there's a bid-ask gap. If you right now had a project that you had just bought and you had this low debt on it, you're not going to sell it. If you thought you were kind of a merchant person, you hold it for 2 or 3 years, the rents would go up and now the value's gone up, you can sell it. That's probably not happening. So this bid-ask spread is going to get very wide for a while. The trouble is the first things that get noticed during a downturn is actually the fact it's all going to be foreclosures. So it's not really what you want. You want true seller-buyer type situations going on, not distressed. I already talked about decreasing values. Insurance costs are up. Everybody knows insurance costs are up. You know what sucks for what's caused the apartment values to drop 21% over the last 2 years? Insurance and real estate taxes. My insurance on my portfolio, my apartment portfolio, in 2021 went up 21%. The next year it went up 21%. This year I heard, or as I was retiring, it went up another 21%. The trouble when you keep doing that is I cannot pass that through to my tenants. It even hurts you on the office building side. Remember, a lot of these tenants pay triple net leases, so they're going to have to pay that increase in insurance expense. Their occupancy costs are going to go through the roof. Some will just leave. What they'll actually end up doing is actually just going to B product, or they'll renegotiate their lease and try to get their leases lowered. Real estate taxes is the laggard. Real estate taxes are going up because the values actually get by local appraisers, and their municipalities have a tendency to be lag and not move up. The values that fast, they're still moving up, so real estate taxes are still going up. And remember CapEx. CapEx happens in the real estate world. A lot of people that don't understand real estate, particularly investment banking types, don't realize that you've got to spend on these properties constantly, and it hurts your net cash flow. Not your NOI, but your net cash flow. And so there's going to be properties that get distressed and nobody will spend money on the CapEx. They won't take care of their elevator systems. They won't take care of their roofs. So that's going to be one of the things that happens in this kind of cycle. New development isn't really happening unless you've got a good lease. And the last thing I kind of bring up here is the denominator effect. On Sunday, there was an article about pension funds getting out of private equities. And the biggest thing they got in private equities was real estate. The denominator effect means when the value of your portfolio changes, you've got to suddenly get it back into line. And one of the things that they're finding out is a lot of them have overexposure to real estate. Okay? Not only that, they know the real estate values are going down. So the bond portfolio is moving. There are other securities in their portfolio are moving. So this denominator effect is not necessarily good for real estate and pension funds. So you may see them pull back a little bit. It happens with any kind of big investor portfolio. Here's that index just kind of showing you what happened over a period of time. It does kind of follow economic cycles. S&P Real Estate Index only does REITs. There may be a proxy that you can kind of see. But if you looked at that, you'd say, gosh, why do I really want to be in this asset class? But remember, it's just REITs. The guys who made the money the most in real estate are usually private equity guys, private developers. Okay, so I'm going to end with this. We are now in the big reset. The big reset is in process. My view is that real estate interest rates and rates in general are going to be somewhere between 4 and 5%. That's going to screw everybody who had models that believed they had to have debt at 3.5. Values are going to go down. You're going to have to get used to paying debt that's this high. Remember I told you when I first started, some of my first loans at MetLife were at 8%. Imagine that trying to get a yield that you're trying to target with 8% debt. That's going to be a problem. Some of the opportunities, and I've talked to some of my old folks, even my old bosses at MetLife, some people are just sitting by. They're not going to invest. They may do some lending here and there. They're not going to buy anything because they don't know what value is. They all want discounts right now. So a lot of people are standing still. So the transaction volume has gone down. And there's a reason because everybody is trying to do price discovery. I already told you about foreclosures or loan sales. I think there will be more loan sales than foreclosures. Eventually, those loan sales become foreclosures or they get worked out. That's why I put the maybe on there. One thing all the brokers are doing right now is they aren't making money doing sales transactions. What they're actually doing is broker opinions of value. That's to supplement the appraisals. Everybody wants to know real time what values are. So that's all a lot of the brokers are doing right now. So again, kind of ending, equity capital sitting on the sideline. Some of the investors that went through this cycle that didn't know much about our real estate are going to want out. That's not necessarily good for the real estate market. We want lenders and we want equity all the time. And I talked to you about the future of prop tech. I've been actually looking at some AI models that try to help you invest in equity real estate. They're not perfect. They're all about the inputs. So if you can understand the inputs with Argus or any valuation model you use, you better understand the inputs with AI. I'm not sure I can trust it all the way yet because I'm not sure of their data sources. That would probably take some time, but pay attention to AI. That is going to be the future. So, thanks for listening. Go Gators. Sorry it took so much time.